The courthouse hallway buzzed with activity on Monday morning. People shuffled in and out of the security checkpoint, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Officer James Miller stood outside Courtroom 4B, his back straight and his uniform crisp. He'd been with the courthouse security team for 8 years now, and he prided himself on knowing the regular faces and maintaining order. Today was different. The Patterson case had drawn national attention, filling the courthouse with reporters, legal observers, and curious onlookers. Officer Miller had been instructed to keep a tight watch on who entered the courtroom. No more spectators until the afternoon session, he told a group of disappointed law students. Judge Henley's orders. The hallway finally cleared a bit, giving Officer Miller a moment to catch his breath. He checked his watch. 9:47 a.m. The proceedings would resume in 13 minutes. That's when he noticed her hurrying down the hallway. A black woman in her early 50s, dressed in a navy blue pantsuit carrying a leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to hold a small library. She walked with purpose, her eyes focused on Courtroom 4B. Officer Miller stepped forward, positioning himself in front of the door. "Sorry, ma'am. The morning session is full. No more entries until 2 p.m. The woman looked up at him, surprise flashing across her face. "Excuse me? I need to be inside for the 10 a.m. session." "I understand, but Judge Henley was clear about capacity limits. You'll have to return this afternoon." Officer Miller kept his tone professional but firm, the same voice he'd used with dozens of people already that morning. There must be some misunderstanding. The woman set down her briefcase and reached into her jacket pocket. "I'm Dr. Elaine Washington. I'm expected inside." Officer Miller barely glanced at whatever card she was trying to show him. He'd seen all kinds of tricks from people trying to get into high-profile cases. Press passes, fake court documents, even counterfeit law enforcement IDs. "Ma'am, everyone here is expected somewhere. But the courtroom is at capacity and I have strict orders." He gestured toward the bench farther down the hallway. "You're welcome to wait, but I can't let anyone else in right now." Dr. Washington took a deep breath. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I need to be in that courtroom when proceedings begin. Could you please check with someone inside? They're expecting me." A group of attorneys walked past, nodding to Officer Miller as they entered the courtroom without being stopped. Dr. Washington noticed this, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Those are the attorneys of record," Officer Miller explained, reading her expression. "They're on my list." "And did you check to see if I'm on that list?" Dr. Washington asked, her voice still calm but with an edge of frustration. Officer Miller fought the urge to sigh. Every day people tried to convince him they were special cases. "Ma'am, I know everyone on the list. The legal teams, the witnesses scheduled for today, and the approved observers. If you were supposed to be in there, I'd know." Dr. Washington opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I have the court summons right here. I flew in from Washington, D.C. specifically for today's proceedings." A young man approached, and Officer Miller held up his hand to stop him. "Courtroom's full. Come back at 2. The young man nodded and walked away without argument. Officer Miller turned back to Dr. Washington, who was still holding out the folder. "Look, I appreciate your persistence, but rules are rules. The courthouse is especially busy today with the Patterson case. Everyone thinks their reason for being here is important." Dr. Washington closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering patience from some hidden reserve. When she opened them, her gaze was steady and direct. "Officer, I'm not just here to observe. I have an official role in today's proceedings. If you would take just a moment to verify—" "Ma'am," Officer Miller cut in, his patience wearing thin. "I've been stationed at this door since 7 a.m. I've checked in every person authorized to be in that courtroom. Your name never came up." A courthouse clerk hurried past, arms full of files. Dr. Washington tried to get her attention, but the young woman was moving too quickly, disappearing around a corner. "This is unacceptable," Dr. Washington said, her voice finally showing real frustration. "I need to speak with someone in charge of courthouse security." Officer Miller crossed his arms. "That would be Lieutenant Rivera, and he's currently handling a situation downstairs. He'll tell you the same thing I am. No one enters without proper clearance, and the courtroom is at capacity." The tension between them was drawing attention now. A few people waiting on nearby benches watched the exchange with interest. Officer Miller felt a flash of annoyance. He didn't like creating scenes in the hallway. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I understand you're disappointed. A lot of people want to see this case. but causing a disruption isn't going to help your situation. Dr. Washington stared at him, clearly taken aback. I'm not causing a disruption. I'm trying to fulfill my court-ordered duties. This is absurd. She reached into her pocket again and pulled out an ID card, holding it up. Please, just look at this properly. Officer Miller glanced at the card, seeing a Department of Justice seal, but he'd seen plenty of government IDs before. Lots of federal employees thought their credentials gave them special access. DOJ employees still need to be on the approved list for this particular proceeding, he said. Security protocols are especially tight for the Patterson case. Dr. Washington slipped the ID back into her pocket. Officer, she glanced at his nameplate. Miller, I understand protocols. I've worked in federal courts for over 20 years, but you're making a mistake. The large clock on the wall showed 9:53 a.m., 7 minutes until the session resumed. Officer Miller felt the pressure of time. The hallway was getting busier again as people returned from coffee breaks. Ma'am, I need to focus on my duties now. Please step aside so I can manage the authorized entries. Dr. Washington didn't move. I'd like to speak with Judge Henley's clerk then. Or the court administrator. They're all preparing for the session, Officer Miller said. No one's available to address seating concerns right now. This isn't about seating, Dr. Washington insisted. This is about a tall man in a suit approached them. Is there a problem here, Officer Miller? Officer Miller recognized Thomas Chen, one of the courthouse administrators. No problem, sir. Just explaining to this lady that the courtroom is at capacity for the morning session. Mr. Chen glanced at Dr. Washington, then did a double take. His expression changed instantly. Dr. Washington, we've been waiting for you. Is everything all right? Officer Miller felt a sudden chill. He looked between them, confused. You know this woman, sir? He asked. Of course, Mr. Chen replied, sounding surprised by the question. Dr. Washington is... I've been trying to explain my role to Officer Miller, Dr. Washington interrupted, but he seems convinced I'm just a spectator trying to sneak in. Mr. Chen's eyebrows shot up. Officer Miller, this is Dr. Elaine Washington, the federal oversight official appointed specifically for the Patterson case. She's supposed to be seated at the bench with Judge Henley. The words hit Officer Miller like a bucket of cold water. He felt heat rising to his face as the realization sank in. The woman he'd been blocking, the one he'd dismissed repeatedly, was not only authorized to be in the courtroom, she was one of the most important officials in today's proceedings. I didn't, Officer Miller stammered, suddenly unable to find words. It's almost 10, Dr. Washington said, checking her watch. We should go in. Mr. Chen nodded, picking up her briefcase for her. Of course, Doctor. Judge Henley was asking about you earlier. As they moved toward the door, Dr. Washington paused beside Officer Miller, who was still frozen in place. Perhaps, she said quietly, next time someone shows you credentials, you might want to actually look at them. Officer Miller stood aside, his face burning with embarrassment as Mr. Chen held the door open for Dr. Washington. As they disappeared into the courtroom, the officer caught whispers from people who had witnessed the exchange. The clock struck 10 a.m. Officer Miller resumed his position by the door, but his confident stance was gone. For the first time in his 8 years at the courthouse, he felt completely out of his depth. Inside his pocket, his phone vibrated with a text from Lieutenant Rivera. Need to see you when you get a break. Pre-Dr. Washington incident. News traveled fast in the courthouse. Officer Miller swallowed hard, wondering how a routine Monday morning had gone so terribly wrong. The door to courtroom 4B closed with a soft click, but to Officer Miller it sounded like a thunderclap. He stood rigid at his post, feeling the curious glances from people waiting in the hallway. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the sheen of sweat that had formed on his forehead. Lieutenant Rivera's text message burned in his pocket like a hot coal. News traveled fast in the courthouse, and Officer Miller knew this incident wouldn't stay quiet for long. Inside the courtroom, Dr. Washington followed Mr. Chen down the center aisle. The room fell into a hush as they approached the front. Judge Henley, a stern-faced man in his 60s, looked up from his papers. Dr. Washington, he said, his microphone carrying his voice throughout the packed room. We're pleased you could join us. I trust your journey from Washington was pleasant? Dr. Washington nodded professionally as she took her seat. Thank you, Your Honor. The flight was fine. There was a small... Misunderstanding at the door, but it's resolved now. Judge Henley raised an eyebrow but continued with the proceedings. Dr. Washington opened her briefcase and pulled out her materials, trying to focus on the case rather than the frustrating encounter outside. Back in the hallway, Officer Miller checked his watch. His shift at the door would end in 20 minutes when Officer Patel arrived to relieve him. Then he'd have to face Lieutenant Rivera. Miller had always prided himself on being thorough, on knowing who belonged where. How had he missed something this important? A young clerk approached him, coffee in hand. "Hey, Miller. Heard you had a run-in with the federal oversight official." Officer Miller kept his eyes forward. "Just doing my job, keeping track of who enters." The clerk snorted. "Yeah, well, word is she's directly appointed by the Attorney General for this case. Big deal. Like really big deal." Officer Miller's stomach tightened. "I wasn't informed about any federal official joining today." "It was in this morning's briefing email," the clerk said, sipping his coffee. "Sent to all courthouse staff at 6 a.m. Dr. Elaine Washington, Federal Oversight Committee Chair. They even included her photo." Officer Miller's face flushed hot. He'd been running late this morning after his car wouldn't start. He'd skipped checking his email, figuring he'd catch up later. "A rookie mistake, I must have missed it," he said quietly. The clerk shrugged. "Well, Lieutenant Rivera is not happy. Good luck with that meeting." As the clerk walked away, Officer Miller tried to recall his interaction with Dr. Washington more clearly. Had she actually shown him her federal ID? He'd barely glanced at it, assuming it was just another government employee trying to pull rank. He'd been so focused on keeping the capacity limits that he'd failed to actually verify her identity properly. Officer Patel arrived early, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I can take over now, Miller. Lieutenant wants to see you ASAP." Officer Miller nodded, his mouth dry. "Thanks, Patel. Is it true?" she asked quietly. "You stopped Dr. Washington from entering?" "I was following protocol," he said defensively. "The courtroom was at capacity." Officer Patel shook her head slightly. "Protocol includes checking credentials thoroughly, especially government IDs." Officer Miller had no response to that. He headed toward Lieutenant Rivera's office, each step feeling heavier than the last. The courthouse was a maze of hallways and offices, but today, the walk seemed shorter than usual, time compressing as he approached the inevitable confrontation. Lieutenant Rivera's door was open. The lieutenant was a compact man with salt and pepper hair and 25 years of experience in courthouse security. He looked up as Officer Miller appeared in the doorway. "Come in, Miller. Close the door." Officer Miller stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The lieutenant's office was small but organized, with security monitors showing different areas of the courthouse. "Sir, about what happened?" Lieutenant Rivera held up a hand. "Before you say anything, I want to show you something." He turned his computer monitor so Officer Miller could see it. On the screen was the morning's briefing email with Dr. Washington's photo and credentials clearly displayed. "This was sent to every security officer this morning," Lieutenant Rivera said. "It specifically noted that Dr. Washington has top-level clearance for the Patterson case and is to be seated with Judge Henley." Officer Miller swallowed hard. "I was running late this morning, sir. My car broke down and This job requires attention to detail, Miller," Lieutenant Rivera interrupted. "Lives depend on it. Court cases depend on it. Justice depends on it." "Yes, sir. Do you understand the significance of the Patterson case?" Rivera asked. Officer Miller nodded. "Major corruption charges against city officials. Federal involvement due to cross-state activities. And do you understand Dr. Washington's role?" Officer Miller hesitated. "Federal oversight, but I'm not clear on the specifics." Lieutenant Rivera leaned back in his chair. "Dr. Washington is not just any federal official. She's the Deputy Attorney General's special appointee for judicial oversight in cases involving public corruption. She has authority to review and report on every aspect of how this case is handled." Officer Miller felt the blood drain from his face. "I didn't know." "That's apparent," Rivera said dryly. "What's concerning is not just that you missed the briefing email. It's that when presented with federal credentials, you dismissed them without proper examination." Officer Miller wanted to defend himself, to explain about the chaos of the morning, the constant stream of people trying to enter the courtroom with various excuses. But he knew none of that mattered. He had failed to do a fundamental part of his job. "It won't happen again, sir," he said. No, it won't, Rivera agreed. Because you're being reassigned effective immediately. You'll be on the first-floor entrance screening for the remainder of the week. Officer Miller felt a flush of shame. First-floor duty was usually given to the newest officers or those being disciplined. Everyone would know what this meant. Yes, sir, he said stiffly. Lieutenant Rivera's expression softened slightly. Look, Miller, you're a good officer. 8 years, no major incidents until today. But this is serious. Dr. Washington has the ear of people at the highest levels of the Justice Department. How we handle this matters. I understand. The Chief Judge wants to meet with both of us at noon, Rivera continued. Dr. Washington will be there too. I need to know exactly what happened from your perspective. Officer Miller recounted the interaction as accurately as he could, including his dismissal of her credentials and his assumption that she was just another spectator trying to gain entry. When he finished, Lieutenant Rivera was silent for a long moment. Miller, I have to ask, would you have treated her differently if she had been a white man in a suit? The question hit Officer Miller like a physical blow. Sir, I'm not asking if you're racist, Rivera clarified. I'm asking if unconscious bias played a role in how quickly you dismissed her credentials. Officer Miller wanted to deny it immediately, to insist he treated everyone the same. But the lieutenant's steady gaze made him pause and actually consider the question. Would he have been so quick to dismiss an older white man in an expensive suit claiming federal authority? Would he have at least taken the time to properly examine the ID? I don't know, he admitted finally, the words difficult to say. I'd like to think I would have handled it the same regardless, but I can't be certain. Lieutenant Rivera nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty. That's something to reflect on. The noon meeting is in the Chief Judge's chambers. Be prepared to apologize sincerely. Of course, Officer Miller said. As he left the lieutenant's office, Officer Miller felt a weight of realization settling over him. In 8 years at the courthouse, he'd seen thousands of faces, checked countless IDs, made split-second judgments about who belonged where. How many of those judgments had been influenced by unconscious assumptions? The question was uncomfortable, but he couldn't push it away. He headed to the first floor for his new assignment, wondering what he would say to Dr. Washington when they met again at noon. A simple apology seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his mistake. As he passed through the main lobby, he saw her again. Dr. Washington was standing near the building directory speaking with another woman in a dark suit. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space. Dr. Washington's expression remained neutral, but she held his gaze for a moment before turning back to her conversation. That brief look carried more weight than any reprimand Lieutenant Rivera could give. In it, Officer Miller saw something he recognized all too well, the weariness of someone who had faced such assumptions many times before. His new post at the main entrance awaited, along with the noon meeting that loomed ahead. Officer Miller straightened his uniform and continued walking. The day was far from over. The main entrance of the courthouse buzzed with activity as Officer Miller checked IDs and directed visitors through the security scanners. Each time he examined an ID, he found himself being more thorough than usual, studying faces and credentials with newfound attention. The morning's mistake hung heavily on his mind as noon approached. At 11:45, Officer Patel arrived to relieve him. Chief Judge's chambers are on the 3rd floor east wing, she said quietly. Good luck. Officer Miller nodded his thanks and headed for the elevators. His palms were sweaty, and he wiped them against his uniform pants. In 8 years at the courthouse, he'd never been called to the Chief Judge's chambers before. Few security officers ever were. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor to reveal a quieter, more formal atmosphere than the bustling lower levels. The carpet was thicker here, the lighting softer. Portraits of former judges lined the walls, their stern faces seeming to judge him as he passed. Lieutenant Rivera was waiting outside the Chief Judge's chambers, his expression unreadable. Right on time, he said, checking his watch. Remember, be honest and direct. Chief Judge Harrington appreciates straightforwardness. Before Officer Miller could respond, the heavy wooden door opened. A secretary looked out at them. The Chief Judge will see you now. The chambers were spacious and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large desk of polished oak. Chief Judge Harrington, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, stood as they entered. Beside him was Dr. Washington, her expression composed and professional. Lieutenant Rivera, Officer Miller, the chief judge said. Please have a seat. They sat in the chairs arranged before the desk. Officer Miller found himself unable to look directly at Dr. Washington, instead focusing on the edge of the desk. I've asked Dr. Washington to join us because I believe in addressing issues directly, Chief Judge Harrington began. This morning's incident is troubling on several levels. Officer Miller felt his heart rate increase. The chief judge's tone was measured but serious. Dr. Washington, would you share your perspective on what happened? Dr. Washington nodded and turned slightly in her chair to face both the judge and the officers. I arrived at Courtroom 4B approximately 10 minutes before the session was to begin. Officer Miller was at the door and informed me that the courtroom was at capacity. I explained that I had an official role in the proceedings and attempted to show my credentials, but they were dismissed without proper examination. Her voice was calm and factual, without accusation, which somehow made Officer Miller feel worse. Officer Miller, is this an accurate description of events? The chief judge asked. Officer Miller cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Washington's account is accurate. And you didn't recognize Dr. Washington or her position? No, sir. I missed the morning briefing email due to personal transportation issues, and I failed to properly examine her credentials when presented. The responsibility is entirely mine. Chief Judge Harrington nodded, his expression thoughtful. Lieutenant Rivera, your thoughts on this matter? Officer Miller has been with us for 8 years with an exemplary record, Rivera said. This appears to be an isolated incident, but one with serious implications. I've temporarily reassigned him to entrance screening while we address the situation. The chief judge turned to Dr. Washington. And you, Doctor? You've been silent on what you believe should happen next. Dr. Washington folded her hands on her lap. My concern isn't with Officer Miller specifically, but with the systems in place. If a federal official with proper credentials can be blocked from entering a courtroom where she has jurisdiction, we have a procedural problem that needs addressing. For the first time, Officer Miller looked directly at her, surprised by her response. What would you suggest? The chief judge asked. A review of security protocols, particularly around credential verification, she replied, and perhaps additional training on recognizing federal credentials from various agencies. This isn't just about today's incident. It's about ensuring the courthouse functions properly for everyone involved in the judicial process. Chief Judge Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Lieutenant Rivera, would you be willing to conduct such a review? Of course, Your Honor, Rivera replied. We can implement changes within the week. The chief judge turned to Officer Miller. And you, officer, what have you learned from this incident? Officer Miller took a deep breath. That thoroughness cannot be compromised, sir. That I need to be more careful about checking credentials properly, regardless of how busy we are or what assumptions I might make. He hesitated, then turned to Dr. Washington. Dr. Washington, I want to apologize directly to you. My behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful. There's no excuse for not properly examining your credentials, and I'm deeply sorry for the inconvenience and disrespect you experienced. Dr. Washington studied him for a moment before responding. I accept your apology, Officer Miller. But I'd like you to understand something. This morning wasn't my first experience with someone assuming I didn't belong in a place where I have every right to be. She straightened slightly in her chair. What you may not realize is that I'm not just a federal oversight official. I'm a federal judge from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, specially appointed by the Attorney General for this case due to its significance and complexity. Officer Miller felt his face grow hot. The room seemed to spin slightly as the full weight of his mistake became clear. He hadn't just turned away a federal employee. He'd turned away a federal judge. Chief Judge Harrington nodded. Judge Washington is one of our nation's most respected jurists. Her presence in this case is a testament to its importance. I had no idea, Officer Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper. Which is precisely why proper credential verification is essential, Lieutenant Rivera added. Judge Washington's role was clearly outlined in this morning's briefing. Judge Washington leaned forward. Officer Miller, I don't believe you intended any harm. But intention and impact are different things. The impact was that a federal judge was nearly prevented from fulfilling her duties because her credentials weren't taken seriously. Officer Miller nodded, unable to find words adequate for the situation. I propose a solution, Judge Washington continued. addressing the chief judge. Rather than disciplinary action, I suggest Officer Miller be involved in developing the new credential verification protocols. His perspective from today's experience could be valuable. Chief Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. An interesting suggestion. Lieutenant Rivera, your thoughts? If Judge Washington is amenable, I think it could be beneficial, Rivera replied. Officer Miller's experience today could inform our training materials. Then it's settled, the chief judge said. Officer Miller, you'll continue your current assignment this week but will also assist Lieutenant Rivera with the protocol review. And I expect a personal written apology to Judge Washington by the end of the day. Yes, Your Honor, Officer Miller said. Thank you for the opportunity. As they stood to leave, Judge Washington approached Officer Miller directly. Officer, I'd like a word with you privately, if that's acceptable. Lieutenant Rivera and the chief judge exchanged glances. You can use the conference room next door, the chief judge offered. It's empty at the moment. Officer Miller followed Judge Washington into the smaller room, his heart still pounding. What more could she possibly have to say to him? Once the door closed, Judge Washington's formal demeanor softened slightly. Officer Miller, I want to be clear about something. Today was uncomfortable for both of us, but it's also an opportunity. Officer Miller blinked in surprise. An opportunity, Your Honor? Yes, mistakes like this happen daily across the country. People make assumptions based on appearance, and those assumptions have consequences. But rarely do we get the chance to address them so directly. She sat at the edge of the conference table. Before I was a judge, I was a prosecutor. Before that, a public defender. I've spent my entire career in courthouses. And I can't count how many times I've been mistaken for a defendant, a witness, or a family member rather than an attorney. Officer Miller felt a new wave of shame wash over him. I'm truly sorry. I believe that, she said. But more importantly, I believe you can learn from this. When you help revise those security protocols, remember today. Remember that credentials matter more than appearances, and that authority comes in all forms. Officer Miller nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I will, Your Honor. Good. She stood and extended her hand. Then we have an understanding. He shook her hand, noticing the firm grip and direct gaze. Thank you for your grace in handling this situation. A small smile crossed her face. Officer Miller, in my position, you learn that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about growth. She opened the door where Lieutenant Rivera was waiting. He's all yours, Lieutenant. I believe we've reached an understanding. As Judge Washington walked away, heading back toward Courtroom 4B, Officer Miller watched her go, seeing her now through entirely different eyes, not just as a woman he'd mistakenly turned away, but as a federal judge who had shown him more compassion than he probably deserved. Come on, Miller, Lieutenant Rivera said. We've got work to do. Officer Miller nodded and followed his superior, his mind already turning to the protocols they needed to revise. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. News of the morning's incident spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By afternoon, everyone from judges to janitors had heard some version of how Officer Miller had turned away Federal Judge Washington from her own proceedings. Officer Miller felt the weight of curious glances and hushed conversations as he stood at his post by the main entrance. Don't let it get to you, said Officer Patel during their shift change. This place runs on gossip. Next week, they'll be talking about something else. Officer Miller nodded, though he wasn't convinced. Some mistakes fade quickly. Others stick to your reputation like glue. He suspected this one would be the latter. After his shift ended, he didn't head home as usual. Instead, he went to the small security office on the second floor where Lieutenant Rivera had given him a temporary workspace. On the desk sat a thick binder labeled Federal Credential, Recognition Protocols, and a yellow legal pad with Rivera's handwritten notes. He opened his laptop and began drafting his formal apology to Judge Washington. The words came slowly at first, then more easily as he allowed himself to be honest about his failure and his commitment to improvement. He finished the letter, printed it, and sealed it in an envelope. Rather than leave it with the court administrator for delivery, Officer Miller decided to deliver it personally. The Patterson case proceedings had ended for the day, but he'd heard Judge Washington was still in the building, meeting with the prosecution team. He found her in a small conference room on the 4th floor. The door was open, and he could see her sitting alone, reviewing documents spread across the table. He knocked gently on the doorframe. Judge Washington looked up, a flash of surprise crossing her face before her expression returned to professional neutrality. Officer Miller. Excuse me, Your Honor, I wanted to deliver this personally. He held out the envelope. She took it, setting it aside without opening it. Thank you. That wasn't necessary, but I appreciate the gesture. Officer Miller nodded, about to turn and leave when she spoke again. How's the protocol review coming along? He paused. It's eye-opening, Your Honor. There are over 50 types of federal credentials that courthouse officers should recognize, and I'd only been familiar with about half of them. Judge Washington nodded. Most people don't realize how complex our federal system is. Even within the judiciary, we have different identification depending on the circuit and position. Officer Miller hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering him all day. May I ask something, Your Honor? Go ahead. You could have simply told me who you were this morning. You could have insisted. Why didn't you? Judge Washington set down her pen and considered him for a moment. Would you have believed me? The question caught him off guard. Would he have? Or would he have dismissed her claim as another attempt to gain entry? I'm not sure, he admitted. Exactly, she said. In that moment, you had already decided who I was and what my purpose was. Sometimes it's better to let such assumptions play out to their natural conclusion. She gestured to a chair. Sit for a moment if you have time. Officer Miller sat, feeling strangely nervous to be having a one-on-one conversation with a federal judge. Have you ever heard of implicit bias, Officer Miller? He nodded. It was covered in our training. Unconscious assumptions we make about people based on appearance or other factors. Yes, and we all have them, myself included, she said. The key isn't to pretend they don't exist, but to recognize when they might be influencing our decisions. Officer Miller thought about this morning, how quickly he'd categorized her as just another spectator trying to gain entry, how little attention he'd paid to her credentials. I've been thinking about that all day, he admitted, whether I would have treated a white man in a suit the same way. Judge Washington's expression softened slightly. That's a good question to ask yourself. Not to induce guilt, but to create awareness. Outside the conference room, courthouse staff were leaving for the day, their footsteps and conversations creating a gentle background noise. You know, Judge Washington continued, I've been in the legal system for over 30 years. Things have improved since I started, but some experiences remain frustratingly common. She straightened a stack of papers in front of her. Last year, I was presiding over a major corporate fraud case. During a recess, I stepped into the elevator wearing regular clothes instead of my robe. A lawyer who had just argued before me asked if I was the court reporter. Officer Miller winced. What did you do? A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. I simply said, no, I'm the judge. You should have seen his face when court resumed and I took the bench. Despite his discomfort, Officer Miller found himself smiling too. I imagine it looked something like mine this morning. Very similar, she agreed. The momentary lightness faded as Officer Miller thought about the implications of her story. It must be exhausting, he said quietly. Having to constantly prove you belong in spaces where you've earned your place. Judge Washington looked at him with slight surprise, as if she hadn't expected this insight. It can be, she acknowledged, but it also makes me a better judge. I never assume I know someone's story based on their appearance. I look at evidence, at facts, at behavior, not at surface impressions. Officer Miller nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I'm trying to learn from this, Your Honor. Lieutenant Rivera and I spent the afternoon reviewing every federal credential type and creating a new verification system for courthouse security. That's good to hear, she said. Systemic changes matter more than individual apologies. She glanced at her watch. I should get back to these briefs. The Patterson case resumes early tomorrow. Officer Miller stood. Of course, Your Honor, thank you for your time. As he turned to leave, Judge Washington spoke once more. Officer Miller? He paused in the doorway. Yes, Your Honor. That letter, she said, nodding toward the envelope he'd delivered. I'll read it, but I already accept your apology. What matters now is moving forward. Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Miller left the conference room feeling strangely lighter. The embarrassment and shame of the morning's incident were still there. But alongside them was something new, a sense of purpose, of commitment to improvement. The next morning, Officer Miller arrived at the courthouse an hour early. He read through every email, memorized the day's expected visitors, and studied the credential verification guide he and Lieutenant Rivera had created. By the time his shift began at the main entrance, he felt prepared. The morning rush brought the usual mix of attorneys, witnesses, and visitors, each presenting various forms of identification. Officer Miller checked each one thoroughly, regardless of who presented it. Around 9:30, a courier arrived with packages for several judges, including Judge Washington. Officer Miller directed him to the proper delivery entrance, making sure to follow the updated protocols for screening deliveries to federal officials. "Someone's being extra careful today," the courier remarked with a smile. "Just doing my job properly," Officer Miller replied, at lunchtime. Lieutenant Rivera stopped by his station. "How's it going?" "Good, sir. No issues so far," Rivera nodded. "Chief Judge Harrington reviewed our protocol updates this morning. He's approved them for immediate implementation and wants them distributed to all courthouse security by the end of the week." "That's fast," Officer Miller said. Surprised. Judge Washington's involvement expedited things. When a federal judge takes interest in security protocols, people listen. Rivera checked his watch. "Speaking of which, she asked if you could assist with a demonstration during tomorrow's security briefing. She wants to show the team how federal judicial credentials should be properly verified." Officer Miller felt a flutter of nervousness. "She wants me to help?" "Her specific request," Rivera confirmed, "said something about turning mistakes into teaching moments." After Rivera left, Officer Miller continued his duties with renewed focus. Each person who passed through his checkpoint was treated with the same level of scrutiny and respect, regardless of appearance. He was particularly careful with government credentials, taking the time to verify their authenticity using the new protocols. Late in the afternoon, as his shift was ending, he saw Judge Washington exit the elevator with several other attorneys. She was deep in conversation, her expression serious as she discussed some aspect of the case. As the group passed through the lobby toward the exit, her eyes met Officer Miller's briefly. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, which he returned with a respectful, "Good evening, Your Honor." It was a simple exchange, barely noticeable to anyone else in the busy lobby. But to Officer Miller, it represented something significant, a mutual recognition, a professional respect that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. As he watched the group leave the building, Officer Miller reflected on how quickly life could change. Yesterday morning, he'd been confident in his role and his judgments. By afternoon, that confidence had been shattered. And now, he was rebuilding it on a more solid foundation. Tomorrow, he would help Judge Washington demonstrate proper credential verification. Another step forward, another opportunity to turn yesterday's mistake into something constructive. Officer Miller gathered his things and headed for the exit. The courthouse would be here tomorrow, with its routines and protocols, its judges and attorneys, its constant stream of human stories. And he would be here too, a little wiser than before, his eyes a little more open to the assumptions that had guided him for too long. 6 weeks had passed since the incident with Judge Washington. The Patterson case had concluded with guilty verdicts for 3 city officials, making headlines across the state. Life at the courthouse had largely returned to its normal rhythm, though some things had changed significantly. Officer Miller stood in the courthouse training room, watching as 20 new security officers practiced credential verification using the protocols he had helped develop. Each officer worked in pairs, one presenting various types of identification while the other verified them using the new step-by-step procedure. "Remember," Miller said, walking between the groups, "federal judicial credentials always have these specific security features. Take your time and check each one, regardless of who's presenting them." Lieutenant Rivera entered, nodding approvingly as he observed the training session. "Looking good, Miller. How's the new batch coming along?" "They're picking it up quickly," Officer Miller replied. "The visual guide makes a big difference." The visual guide had been Officer Miller's idea, a comprehensive booklet showing every type of federal, state, and local credential that might be presented at the courthouse, with clear images of security features to verify. The chief judge had approved the budget for producing them after seeing the prototype for Chief. "Judge Harrington wanted me to let you know that the administrative office of the U.S. Courts is interested in our protocol updates," Rivera said. They're considering implementing similar changes in federal courthouses nationwide. Officer Miller felt a surge of pride, tempered by the humbling knowledge of how the changes had come about. "That's great news, sir. You should be proud," Rivera said. Not many officers would have turned a mistake into something this productive. After the training session ended, Officer Miller returned to his regular post at Courtroom 6A. He had been reassigned there after completing his week at the main entrance, a sign that the incident, while not forgotten, was no longer defining his career. The afternoon session was just ending, and people filed out of the courtroom. Officer Miller checked his watch, 4:45 p.m. Just 15 more minutes until his shift ended. "Officer Miller?" He looked up to see the court clerk, Ms. Patel, approaching. "Judge Harrington would like to see you in his chambers when you finish your shift." Officer Miller felt a flutter of nervousness. "Did he say what it's about?" "No, but Judge Washington is there too." His nervousness increased. He hadn't seen Judge Washington since the Patterson case concluded 2 weeks ago. She had returned to Washington, D.C. shortly after the verdict. At 5 p.m., Officer Miller knocked on the Chief Judge's door, his uniform freshly straightened. "Come in," called Judge Harrington's voice. The Chief Judge was seated behind his desk. Judge Washington sat in one of the visitor chairs, dressed in a dark blue suit similar to the one she'd worn on that first morning. "Officer Miller, thank you for coming," Judge Harrington said. "Please have a seat." Officer Miller sat in the chair beside Judge Washington, nodding respectfully to her. "Your Honor, it's good to see you again." "Likewise, Officer Miller," she replied with a small smile. Chief Judge Harrington leaned forward. "Judge Washington is in town for a judicial conference and stopped by to discuss the security protocol changes we've implemented. I thought you should be part of this conversation." Judge Washington turned slightly to face Officer Miller. "I've been following the changes you and Lieutenant Rivera have made. The credential verification system is particularly impressive." "Thank you, Your Honor," Officer Miller said. "We've tried to be thorough." "More than thorough," Judge Harrington added. "The administrative office has reviewed your protocols and wants to adapt them for federal courthouses nationwide. They're sending a representative next month to see them in action." Officer Miller blinked in surprise. "I had no idea it would go that far." "That's actually why I wanted to meet with you," Judge Washington said. "I've been asked to lead a judicial committee on courthouse security protocols, and we'd like your input." "My input?" Officer Miller repeated, unable to hide his surprise. Judge Washington nodded. "Sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from people who have recognized gaps in the system firsthand. Your experience identified a weakness in how federal credentials are verified, and your solution has been remarkably effective." Officer Miller felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in the recognition, lingering embarrassment about the incident that had started it all, and genuine appreciation for Judge Washington's generous framing of his experience. "I'd be honored to help." "Your Honor," he said. Chief Judge Harrington smiled. "Excellent. And there's one more thing we wanted to discuss with you." He slid a folder across the desk. Officer Miller opened it to find a job description for training coordinator. "Courthouse security. We're creating this position to standardize security training across all shifts," Judge Harrington explained. "Lieutenant Rivera suggested you would be an excellent candidate." Officer Miller looked up in surprise. "Sir, I'm honored, but..." "Before you respond," Judge Washington interrupted gently, "I'd like to share something with you." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a familiar envelope, the apology letter Officer Miller had hand-delivered to her 6 weeks earlier. "I've kept this," she said, "not because I needed the apology, but because of what you wrote about turning a difficult moment into an opportunity for growth. That's surprisingly rare, Officer Miller. Most people become defensive when confronted with their mistakes. You chose to learn instead." Officer Miller felt a lump forming in his throat. He remembered writing those words, sitting alone in the small security office, determined to make something meaningful from his failure. The position would involve training all new security officers and conducting regular refresher courses for existing staff. Judge Harrington continued. "You'd also serve as our liaison to other courthouses implementing similar protocols. It would mean a pay increase and more regular hours," he added. "Though I understand if you prefer to remain in your current role." Officer Miller looked between the two judges, still processing the unexpected offer. "Could I have a day to think about it?" "Of course," Judge Harrington said. Let Lieutenant Rivera know your decision by Friday." As the meeting concluded and they stood to leave, Judge Washington extended her hand. "Whatever you decide, Officer Miller, I want to thank you." He shook her hand, puzzled. "Thank me, Your Honor. 6 weeks ago, you could have simply apologized and moved on, treating the incident as an embarrassing memory to forget. Instead, you helped create meaningful change that deserves recognition." After saying goodbye to the judges, Officer Miller walked slowly through the courthouse corridors. The building was quieter now, the day's business concluded. A few late-working attorneys hurried past, briefcases in hand, but mostly the massive building had that peaceful feeling it got in the evening, when the day's dramas had concluded. Near the main entrance, Officer Miller paused by the newly installed credential verification station, a well-lit counter with a magnifying glass and UV light for security feature verification. It was a small change, but an important one. He thought about the job offer, about the unexpected turns his career had taken since that morning 6 weeks ago. From the shame of his mistake to the pride of creating something valuable from it, the journey had been humbling and affirming in equal measure. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Dinner in the oven. How was your day?" "Interesting," he typed back. "I'll tell you all about it when I get home." As Officer Miller pushed through the heavy courthouse doors into the evening air, he felt a sense of gratitude. Not for the mistake he'd made, he still regretted that, but for what had come after. The chance to learn, to improve, to create something meaningful from a difficult moment. Tomorrow he would accept the training coordinator position. And someday, perhaps years from now, when some other officer made a similar mistake, the systems Officer Miller had helped put in place would be there to catch it before it happened, before someone else had to feel unwelcome in a place where they belonged. That, he realized, was the most meaningful apology he could offer to Judge Washington. Not words in a letter, but lasting change that would benefit others long after both of them had moved on. Officer Miller headed toward the parking lot, the golden evening light casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Behind him, the building stood solid and imposing as it had for decades, but within its walls, something had shifted, had improved, had grown, just as he had.